In early 2016, North Korea detonated a nuclear weapon and it tested a missile. And this occasioned a typical debate in the analyst community about what drives North Korea, what are its motivations. Right? So there's this large discussion about what is the real North Korea. And we have these models about North Korea that try to explain it, that have been around for a long time. During the Cold War, for example, we understood North Korea as a Marxist alternative to South Korea. There's this sort of neoconservative argument that North Korea is a rogue state. There are leftist critiques that suggest that North Korea is actually a neo-Confucian monarchy with deep roots in Korean history. But I want to argue that these are incorrect, that these models don't get to what's fully going on in North Korea. And I want to argue that North Korea is best understood as a mafia state. Right? That is, if we look at what North Korea does rather than what it says, if we ignore North Korean ideology, if we look at North Korea post-ideologically, then we can say that North Korea actually engages in a great deal of criminal activity and represents something like what would happen if the mafia took over an entire country. And I want to argue there are really 5 points that make this claim. The first is that North Korea is run at the top by an extended kinship or clan structure that looks a great deal like the mafia. You have a central Don and the people around him, his retainers and cronies and henchmen, who are related by blood, by friendship, by ties that go back generations. Right? The North Korean elite is not actually composed of people promoted for ideological or meritocratic reasons. So if you look at, for example, Kim Il-sung and the people who he promoted, they were all people who were his friends back during the war and during the Japanese occupation. If you look at the modern elite today, it's all relatives. It's aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and friends and things like that, right? Even the North Korean internal system is structured this way, right? It's known as the Songbun system, where blood ties are actually what determine your position in the North Korean system rather than things like merit. Okay. The second point I want to argue is that among this elite, order is maintained through rather traditional mafia methods, that is to say carrots and sticks. Right? So carrots, for example, right? We have these various competing factions and groups inside North Korea, the party, the military, friends of the Kim family, right? And they control various resources inside North Korea. North Korea is a pretty poor place. Right? There's a great deal of privation. So control of these resources, things like fishing or mining, relationships with Chinese investors, Chinese banks, these are controlled by various groups inside North Korea. Right? But if someone rises too quickly, if someone becomes a threat to the North Korean elite, they're often pushed aside in ways that remind us of the mafia. So, for example, Jang Song-taek recently was pushed aside and he was eliminated fairly harshly. This reminds us of the way that the mafia eliminates people through hits and clips and things like this. Right? Now, in mafia in communist states, these are often referred to as purges, but in North Korea, it's fairly similar to what the mafia does, right? But attacking these elites is dangerous, so it's also useful to buy them off. And again, this is somewhat similar to the mafia does. You buy off various factions and groups inside your regime by offering them resources to prevent them from actually rising up and overthrowing the structure of the system. Inside North Korea, you really see this in the 1990s. Right? Communist ideology had basically failed during the Cold War was over, and so the new leadership under Kim Jong-il, the second leader of North Korea, right, he composed a bargain. He built a bargain between North Korean elites, right, in which they were given important positions and access to resources in exchange for not overthrowing him. This was known as Songun, the military first policy, which promoted the army at the expense of other institutions, right, and the idea was to prevent them from overthrowing him at Kim Jong-il, and in exchange they were given all sorts of resources and access. Right? And so this Songun bargain is propped up through this criminalistic activity. So the third argument I want to make for why North Korea is similar to the mafia is that North Korea very often ignores contracts in some ways similar to the mafia. Right? The mafia very often approaches contracts as something to be disposed of when they get in the way, right, in order to pursue short-term material gain. And that if they can simply be ignored, if you don't have to pay your bookie because you have enough, thugs with you or something like that, you can simply ignore contract. And this is the way North Korea often approaches both international investors and its own population. Right? Even Chinese investors in North Korea have had a great deal of difficulty. They come into North Korea and they think they have political protection, but it turns out they do not. They're shaken down by local elites who demand access to the facility. They want a bribe, they want a car, something like this. We know that North Korea has shaken down in a similar way UN aid agencies that have operated in North Korea. We know that they do this, behave somewhat similarly with South Korean groups that operate in North Korea, when the South Koreans have provided things like the Kaesong Industrial Plant Zone or the tours around Mount Kumgang. Very often the North Koreans have demanded that the South Koreans pay for everything. When they have joint sporting events, the demands are made that South Korea pay for everything. And so this is essentially a racketeering approach, right? The North Koreans are basically demanding that other people pay for things and they ignore contract to their benefit. So the fourth point I want to argue, and I think this is maybe the strongest one, is that North Korea conducts large-scale criminal enterprises. When we often think of the mafia engages in these protracted, these expanded criminal projects, right? And North Korea does this too. So North Koreans, for example, raise a great deal of illicit money by insurance fraud or the trafficking in persons, the trafficking in weapons. They engage in the international black market for nuclear technology. The North Koreans have trafficked in methamphetamines, right? And all these things remind us of what the mafia does, right? That the mafia raises a great deal of money through activities that are illegally sanctioned. Now, of course, it's very hard to know how much the North Koreans actually raise from doing this, but the North Koreans have actually been doing this for a while. Beginning in the 1970s, the North Koreans needed to raise hard currency, and they began to exploit their diplomatic missions overseas to move money and gold illegally, to engage in various criminal activities. We also know that the North Koreans engage in extensive counterfeiting. The super dollar is a term that the US Treasury has coined for the production of fake dollars inside North Korea. The North Koreans also counterfeit RMB from China and euros, and all of this is done in order to facilitate the trade in particularly in nuclear technology that the North Koreans need in order to develop the program. They need these external resources, and so they don't really have anything to trade, and so they engage in a great deal of illicit activity. And again, this is fairly similar to what the mafia does in order to raise funds. Okay. And so the fifth point that I wanted to argue, I think the fifth point that really makes this claim that North Korea is akin to the mafia, is that North Korea is actually deeply corrupt. This is something that we also associate with the mafia, right? That bribery and payoffs are how the mafia interacts with the larger state, and this is how North Korea interacts both internally, right? Elites interact themselves this way, and also with international investors and with the rest of the international community. The best example of this is the ranking by Transparency International of North Korea as the second most corrupt state in the world. I believe the first one is Somalia. This has been a real problem in North Korea now for going on 25 years, this intense corruption, and this is fairly similar to the mafia, again, where sort of bribery and payoffs in order to get what you want rather than following contract is the method of business. So I think if you take these 5 points, you can argue that North Korea is akin to what would happen if the mafia took over an entire country. Now, we don't actually have a great deal of models for this. It's not really clear what it would look like if something like the Corleone family from the Godfather films took over an entire country, but I believe that applies here relatively well. Perhaps you can see this today in a place like Zimbabwe or Russia, but in this way I think North Korea is rather sui generis, it's rather distinct, it's rather unique. But I think it does give us some way to move forward on the policy question of how to respond to North Korea when it pulls these tests and these other sort of various misbehaviors, such as the landmine incident at the demilitarized zone. Like, how do we respond to North Korea? Right? Well, if money is what really matters, right? If this flow of illicit resources into Pyongyang in order to maintain this Songun bargain between elites to prevent them from overthrowing the regime, right? If that's what's really central, if the Songun bargain requires these illicit dollars, then going after those dollars is the way to provoke tension within the elite and hopefully force them to change. Right? And I think if you look at the way the sanctions debate has developed in the last couple of months, particularly since the nuclear test in January of 2016, I think it verifies this analysis. There's been a great deal of focus not on sanctioning North Korea yet again, not actually going after North Korean structures or North Korean elites and the state itself, but to actually start going after their money. That this is what would hit them where it really hurts, right? Because they could not import the things that they need to maintain this elite structure of corruption. They wouldn't be able to import the HD TVs and the snowmobiles and the high-end liquor and all the other things that we associate with the corrupt sort of mafia elite that run the country. And so this is what the UN, I think, has proposed, is going after North Korea's money now. This, I think, will be quite difficult because much of that money is parked in third-party banks, particularly we think in China, which would provoke conflict between the United States and China. That, of course, is pretty difficult. That raises pretty significant issues. It does reflect the acceptance of this idea that North Korea is really not a Marxist state. It's not some barrack state. It's not some Confucian monarchy from the past, that it really is a corrupted mafia state which needs money. And if we go after that money, we can force them to change. Thank you.